You blame me for slavery 100 years before I was born, guilty of being white. These are the lyrics of a popular Minor Threat song that is oddly relevant in today's climate, and I think only becomes more and more relevant as time goes on, what with the ever-present and ever-increasing presence of post-colonial theory in the discourse surrounding contemporary race issues and economic issues in the Western world. Post-colonial theory is gaining more and more prominence. It's being legitimized in many respects by mainstream voices even. And I think this is actually quite harmful because, in my estimation, post-colonial theory is just traditionalism from the left. If you look at the things that people say who advocate for this side, they're regularly talking about preserving regularly talking about preserving traditional ways of life from foreign invaders. They're talking about the idea that white culture or foreign culture more broadly is encroaching on indigenous communities and historically colonized people, and that this is bad because there's some kind of inherent value that the traditions of those no doubt oppressed people have. But I think it's perfectly possible to acknowledge the oppression that those people are facing and to have substantive policy solutions for the very real problems that those groups are being afflicted by. I think, namely, going after the elite, the powerful, through taxation or redistribution of land, redistribution of the means of production. There are all kinds of policy points we can get into. Even something as simple as like tax breaks and divesting the funding that the government makes into those communities that are historically harmed by marginalization. These are all things that fall under the broad umbrella of potential solutions for this marginalization. But once you start getting into discussing like preserving like the sanctity of inherently valuable traditional ways of life, I feel like you've just started making the same kinds of arguments that conservatives make. And the really odd thing about these arguments is that, like I said, foreign ways of life or culture encroaching on these communities, whenever people are making the post-colonial theoretical arguments, they exclusively talk about white culture. They don't talk about the prevalence of Hispanic culture or African American culture or Indian American culture, and I don't mean native or indigenous people, I mean Indians as in from India, or Asian culture. Like, all of the things that make up the salad bowl that is the United States, they don't they don't mention these things as like forms of social imperialism or cultural imperialism. They I think reflexively refuse to mention that these things are even problems in the first place. And it creates this huge void in the discussion where we're exclusively talking about white settlers, which of course have more influence and more prominence. Historically we played the biggest role in the marginalization of that group, but it would be intellectually dishonest to not also mention the very prominent cultures of other minorities that, blend in with all of this, that make up the big salad that is this country. But it's exclusively white people that are talked about. And I see these arguments coming from people that are often talking about the subject of, for example, ethnostates, with like tacit approval. They kind of dance around the subject, but they tend to say things like racism is prejudice plus power, therefore minorities can't be racist. And to that I would say, it's perfectly possible for everyone to be prejudiced in some regard. And of course, because those groups of people are historically marginalized, racism is obviously going to affect them a lot different than it would me, for example. When someone calls me a cracker or goes on a, racial tangent about me, I hear it as just words. Like, those words mean absolutely nothing to me because they have not been uttered to me in a context where I was being abused by groups of people who have a skin color that would seem to denote that they have more power than me. I don't have that history of trauma in my family. I don't have that history of trauma in my own life. And so, of course, when I hear, the black separatist sentiment or anti-white sentiment from minorities, it means absolutely nothing to me. I hear it and it's like it just rolls off. And so, of course, prejudice is not going to mean exactly the same thing. It's not going to have exactly the same impact, but it's nonetheless there. And the experience of being dehumanized, while it doesn't carry the same historical weight for white people, it's nonetheless negative for many of them. And I'm not talking about, using like some funny racial epithet for white people like cracker or something. I'm talking about like outright treating people differently and dehumanizing them. I think this is racism, and and in that sense, I don't think it is about power. But even if we were to give credence to that definition, the moment that you, say, for example, have a revolution in an African country, and you're kicking out all of the white settlers, many of whom probably have children who are not in any way involved with the subjugation of the native population. Many of them simply came there and don't have anything to do with the subjugation of the native population, are killed, by these revolutionaries who want to create this ethno-state, want to, kick the owner class out. And, at that point, you do have power. You're the one who has violently taken the power from the colonialists and distributed it amongst yourselves, and are using prejudice to kick them out. And so, even if we were to entirely agree on that definition, the moment that occurs, the racism is occurring as well. But I see people making these arguments, and they don't see it this way. They see it as though merely because people who look like me, for example, come from a so-called colonial bloodline, hundreds of years ago, people were related to me, were either involved with colonialism or benefited from colonialism, that in some way, I'm personally responsible for it, or people alive now are personally responsible for it. And I think that's just ludicrous. I don't think a history of marginalization gives you an excuse to dehumanize and violate the rights of people. But in response to that marginalization and that colonialism, there should absolutely be substantial changes to the economic base that makes up whatever country we might be looking at. You know, redistributing the wealth from the predominantly white settlers who have, you know, had this huge impact on whatever country we're talking about. That's going to make a huge change, right? You know, putting the means of production in the hands of the people, so it doesn't just go to a new owner class of a different race or creed. I think those things are going to make way more of a difference than committing a genocide on the white population. But people who seem to be involved with post-colonial theory, time and time again, I see that they seem to have no real interest in that, because when you actually push them on their beliefs, it tends to come out as just overt racism. And even if it didn't, like, the tacit approval we see time and time again from many on the left for things like ethnostates, for things like the subjugation of the colonial population and so on, the extreme emphasis on the sacred traditional way of life of these people, it just sounds like traditionalism and conservatism, but it's veiled through this vaguely, ostensibly left-wing message, because it happens to be about the liberation of minorities, because maybe it has some, you know, left-wing economic messaging in there. But fundamentally, it is about prejudice, and it is about conservatism, conserving. And I don't agree with that. Yeah, post-colonial theory is just traditionalism for the left.